I'm a lover of words, and Dr. Seuss has been a big part of our family with with 4 children in our house and being married to a elementary school teacher who is also an English major at Central Michigan University. We've always had Dr. Seuss in our house and loved the literature that he brought to us and the great stories. But there's also another side of Dr. Seuss, and we thought maybe we could talk a little bit about that today. Today happens to be his birthday. And to tell us about it, we're very honored to have Dr. Pamela Gates with us. She's a professor emeritus from Central Michigan University, has both her bachelor's and master's degree from CMU, and then did her PhD from Michigan State University. I think some of you have heard of that institution, and then did some postgraduate work at Harvard as well. Professionally, she was professor of English as associate dean, and for 9 years as dean of the College of Humanities and Social and Behavior Science until she retired in 2018, completing over 30 years at CMU. She's also been very committed to diversity and has been grounded in a lot of her work in research and through decades of involvement in every aspect of diversity with her teaching, committee work, program activity, including work returning Native American remains to their proper burial sites. So it's very fascinating, her background on that. Some of you may have heard her voice before, as she has been on, I know I had, this is where I recognized her name, from WCMU's, if you listen to public radio and at WCMU, she did a program called The Children's Bookshelf, where she reviewed children's literature and brought the importance of diversity into Michigan classrooms for over a decade. So happy to welcome Dr. Pamela Gates as our speaker today, and she's here to tell us about Dr. Seuss on his birthday. So thanks for joining us, and don't forget to unmute, Pamela.
There you go. Am I unmuted now? Okay, thank you. I appreciate your invitation, and so we'll just get started if that works. It's the professor in me. So I'm going to start by saying happy birthday to Dr. Seuss. He was born on March 2nd from 1904 in Springfield, Massachusetts, as Theodore Seuss Giesel. And he would have been 117 today. And he was, I think it's fascinating because he was born the same year as my grandmother. But as we know, he was an American author and illustrator whose children's books became hugely popular and were noted for their nonsense rhymes, playful rhymes, and unusual creatures. During his lifetime, he wrote 60 books and sold over 600 million copies. Seuss earned a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College in 1925 and did some postgraduate studies in literature at Lincoln College in Oxford. It was at Oxford that he met his future wife, Helen Palmer, and they were married from 1927 till her death in 1967. And while Seuss had intended to pursue a doctoral degree in English literature at Oxford, it was Helen who convinced him to pursue his artistic career after seeing his notebooks full of fabulous drawings. While he was a student at Dartmouth College, he worked on a humor magazine called Dartmouth Jack-o'-lantern, where he rose to a position of editor-in-chief. Unfortunately, during that time, this is prohibition, he was caught drinking with friends and was forced to step down. So when he resumed his work with the magazine later, he decided to adopt the pen name of Seuss to avoid scrutiny from the administration, something none of us would have ever done in college, right? Okay. When Seuss returned from London in 1927, he began submitting his work to the Saturday Evening Post and to the humor magazine called Judge. And his work was noticed by a bug spray company called Flit, and it was owned by Standard Oil of New Jersey. And this actually launched his career in advertising, which went on for the next several years, and which would lead to campaigns for actually the Ford Motor Company, NBC Radio, and many others. During this time, he also published kind of an unknown book called Boners, which was a collection of children's sayings that he illustrated. And it was actually published by Viking Press in 1931. Dr. Seuss's first actual children's book, though, was, many of you probably know it. It was And to Think I Saw It on Mulberry Street. And that was actually published by Vanguard Press in 1937, but it was rejected 27 times before it was finally published. It did get some good reviews, but it was by no means a bestseller. Then, as World War II began, Geisel turned his political cartoons and started drawing for political purposes. And he composed over 400 cartoons in 2 years as an editorial cartoonist for the left-leaning New York daily newspaper called PM. His political cartoons denounced Hitler and Mussolini and were highly critical of non-interventionists, while other cartoons actually deplored the racism at home against Jews and Blacks that he felt harmed the war effort. His cartoons were strongly supportive of President Roosevelt's handling of the war. In 1942, he turned his energies directly in support of the US war effort. First, he worked on drawing posters for the Treasury Department and the War Production Board. Then in 1943, he joined the Army as a captain and was commander of the animation department of the 1st Motion Picture Unit of the United States Army and Air Forces. There, he wrote films that included one called Your Job in Germany, a 1945 propaganda film about peace in Europe after World War II. I mean, I always find it fascinating to look and see what the history was of individuals that we have grown to love as authors. So I found most of that very fascinating in my own research. After the war, though, Dr. Seuss returned to his focus to writing books for children. And in 1954, Life magazine published a report about illiteracy among children, indicating that children were not learning to read because their books were boring. The director at the time of the Education Division of Houghton Mifflin compiled a list of about 350 words that he felt were important for first grade children to recognize. And he actually challenged Dr. Seuss to write a book using at least 250 of those words that would actually engage children. Seuss took on that challenge brilliantly, and out of that, he created The Cat in the Hat. And he also created Green Eggs and Ham and One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. All of those books were designed for beginning readers and are very, very popular still today. So he got us thinking more about the importance of literacy all the way back to the 50s. In 2019, though, a widely cited study in educational circles accused Dr. Seuss of being racist. And I think this is something that many of us are concerned about. The study was actually titled, "The Cat is Out of the Bag: Orientalism, Anti-Blackness, and White Supremacy in Dr. Seuss Children's Books." It claimed that Dr. Seuss did draw comedic cartoons that are today widely considered offensive and racist in several journals. There's a number of articles written, and I would encourage anyone to take a look at those because they are quite painful to see in terms of what the cartoons were. Now, I think that they are time bound, but I think that we can talk about that in a little bit. In response to this report, though, the National Education Association, which actually founded the Dr. Seuss Read Across America Day Week event that we're actually celebrating here, decided to rebrand the event and called it the National Education Read Across America Day. By doing so, it has provided a way to distance itself from Dr. Seuss and introduce a more racially diverse selection of books for its students. In addition, it also provide a more clearly defined NEA reading event. And I'd like to share, this is the press release that they actually shared. Effective August 31st, 2019, NEA will no longer have a licensing agreement with Dr. Seuss Enterprises. After August 31st, NEA affiliates and members may no longer use the Read Across America logo with the cat in the hat leaning over a US map. A new Read Across America logo has been developed and is available to members. Then in late February of this year, so we're talking just a couple of weeks ago, the Loudoun School District in Virginia was accused of banning Dr. Seuss books. However, the district released the following statement saying that it was false. and they said, Dr. Seuss's books had not been banned from Loudoun County Public Schools. LCPS believes this rumor started because March 2nd is Read Across America Day. Schools in the LCPS school district and across the country have historically connected Read Across America Day with Dr. Seuss. Research in recent years has revealed strong racial undertones in many books written and illustrated by Dr. Seuss. Examples include anti-Japanese American political cartoons and cartoons depicting African Americans for sale, captioned with offensive language. The district said, given this research and LCPCS's focus on equity and culturally responsive instruction, we have provided this guidance to schools during the past couple of years to not connect Read Across America Day exclusively with Dr. Seuss's birthday. We continue to encourage our young readers to read all types of books that are inclusive, diverse, and reflective of our student community, not simply celebrate Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss's books have not been banned and are available to our students in libraries and classrooms. However, Dr. Seuss and his books are no longer the emphasis of Read Across America Day. So that school district did not ban Dr. Seuss. Many school districts have decided, and I fully support this, to offer plenty of diversity-based alternatives for children, but they're simply not using Dr. Seuss as the theme. As noted, there is a movement to distance NEA and its teachers from Dr. Seuss. However, as of this year, thousands of districts and teachers are not stopping their support of the annual Read Across America Day, which I think is really very important. Many, however, have indicated that they will include and supplement the theme of Dr. Seuss Read Across America Day with culturally diverse books and objectives, which anyone who knows me, I am fully in support of. To that end, I think it's important to note that Dr. Seuss, Theodore Seuss Geisel, was actually born over 100 years ago. And he created the bulk of his work before the era of civil rights in the 1960s. As we review his drawings and illustrations that he created in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there is absolutely no argument that some are fraught with racist and demeaning caricatures that are absolutely not acceptable. In a New York Times interview, though, with his great nephew, Ted Owens, Owen says that he thinks that his uncle would find a legitimate criticism of his work because he remembered talking to him about it. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that Dr. Seuss was a master of storytelling. He chose humor over dogmatism, but at times we can see that the two emerged in interesting combinations. The rhyming, nonsensical verses and strangely creative creatures gave us whales with eyelashes, cats in hats, and foxes in socks. The man who began as a political cartoonist never really left behind his political commentary or parables. From Yertle the Turtle to the Sneetches to the Horton, here's the Who, and I'd be happy to talk about those. Political influences can be found in those who look. As a young adult, two of my favorites were and still remain The Lorax, published in 1971, which was just after the first Earth Day, which I will say I celebrated at my high school, and Oh, the Places You'll Go, his last book published in 1990. And with that, I would like to finish with a couple of my favorite quotes from him, his books, actually. First one, you'll get mixed up, of course, as you already know. You'll get mixed up with many strange birds as you go. So be sure when you step with care and great tact, and remember that life's a great balancing act. Just never forget to be dexterous and deft, and never mix up your right foot with your left. And will you succeed? Yes, you will indeed. 98.75% guaranteed. Kids, you'll move mountains. And then finally, since I know you all have places to go, you're off to great places. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting, so get on your way. Thank you for letting me talk about Dr. Seuss a little bit.
Dr. Gates, I have a
Thank you.
question. You talk about his issues with race, but then some of his books kind of addressed race, like the Yellow Bell,
Absolutely.
with the Sneetches and
Absolutely.
things like that. I guess, how do you compare that or contrast that?
Well, I think that quite honestly, even when you look at his work during World War II, he was absolutely, anti-Hitler. When you talk, Yertle the Turtle was based on was based on Hitler. The first Yertle the Turtle had a mustache, and it was very much anti-Hitler and anti what was going on at that time. The Sneetches, they have the stars, which replicate the prejudice against Jews. And then the Horton, Here's a Who, was his response to his, what he then thought later, his over-the-top response to the Japanese internment. So I think as a human being, as a man, he was not internally racist. I do think that if you look at those drawings that he did in terms of political cartoons, 20s, 30s, and 40s, there are definitely racist overtones. But I don't want us to forget about the time period. We, as a country, unfortunately, we're not sensitive to those horrible kinds of caricatures. We are now, and we would never allow any of that. So I think that there was a balance, and I think I will never not share Dr. Seuss's work with my grandchildren, because I think that what he did for reading, what he did for engaging children with words and with playful language, he did it like no other. And I think that, I remember my own son, who his first book, was, Dr. Seuss and looking at, and he loved redfish, blue, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. He loved all of those things. He thought he could read long before he actually could. So I would never, ever give up on Dr. Seuss. But I do think as adults, we recognize the man's shortcomings as well.
There was a interview of a African-American writer in the Sunday New York Times Book Review. And the interviewer said, would you have children read Tom Sawyer? And because of, the racist content. And he said, yes, I would, but I would also have them read this book and this book and this book, right, and have a conversation, with the children. And a few years ago, I was a literacy volunteer, and I was looking for an easy book, to work with this Latino man on, and I picked up Paul Bunyan. And, Paul Bunyan, I was starting to read it, and it said, oh, and one day he cut down all the trees in Minnesota, and yet it was a great story. So don't you think we ought to, rather than trying to expunge Dr. Seuss, we ought to have ways of conversing about him with children?
I absolutely do. And I think that goes for many things, excuse me, that are going on in our culture. We can't, and the very worst thing we could do is try to expunge our history. That was where my research began, is that we have not always been good or kind to one another in this country or around the world. But to expunge and to think that it didn't happen, as George Santiago said, history will repeat itself. We can't do that. So I think that conversations are absolutely essential. When I was growing up, when many people were growing up, there were books from, I think it was Golden was the name of the publisher, and later Scholastic, A Little Black Sambo. Now, that is considered incredibly racist now because of the caricatures. Mm-hmm. But you can also have the same story told by and illustrated by Brian Pinckney, which is a beautiful rendition of that tale, but done respectfully. So I think that it's our duty as teachers, as educators, parents, grandparents, to make sure that those conversations happen And don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as my grandmother would have said.
Yeah, thank you.
Very well said. We have time for one more question if anybody has something.
Quick comment. You'll be happy to know, Dr. Gates, that my wife went to school today with her Dr. Seuss scarf on and says all prepared to get her fourth graders going on Read Across America Day. So
Yeah, it's a wonderful celebration of reading, and I don't want to ever lose that. So
Cindy,
thank you
did
for
have a
having me.
question?
any other questions?
I was going to ask, the political cartoons that were on the racist side, could the possible overshadowing of that be that the publishers of whatever magazines or who he was writing for, that's what they expected or wanted? He didn't
Well,
necessarily have those personal views, but I mean, we all have jobs where we have employers that have expectations that we may not always agree with,
right.
but we do our job. So is that in there anywhere?
His grandnephew does talk about that and wanted readers to understand that he was a product of his time. And unfortunately, during the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there was not a sensitivity to racist comments and other things. So he was writing political cartoons. He was writing for companies that absolutely saw no problem with that. That's not today, but he was also time bound in those areas. So I think that, we could probably all name a person who is a kind, loving individual that, someone born in 1904 or 1914 might have carried different images than what we would find acceptable today. That doesn't make that person a bad person. It does make that person more time bound. And hopefully, as Dr. Seuss grew out of those things, the individuals in our lives grew out of that as well. So his writing changed. And he was always a political advocate, right up to the Lorax, where he was really pushing for respect of our environment. And so I would not want to lose sight of that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gates. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. And if anything, it really teaches us and reminds us that it's the conversation, having the conversation, not wiping out history, but being able to talk about it and change for the better. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your day, everyone.
Thank you.